the economics of the study and world experience for American university students.
Okay, if you were here this morning, you probably remember the disaster with my PowerPoint. So let's see if, and I verified your particular fear or loathing of PowerPoints. So let's see if this actually is the one that I wanted.
If it isn't, it's going to be even more interesting.
Yes, thank you. So anyway, the term economics in the title was for Gregory. It's not actually about the economics. What I meant to say for this was the cost and the payment of studying abroad for our students at Texas A&M. International programs is part of my job description, in addition to other things, as in charge of, in my college, I'm in charge of about 8,000 students in the College of Liberal Arts. So anyway, it's a well-known fact, and I think you've heard this repeatedly so far today, at least, that study abroad brings with it tremendous benefits for our students. And three can be quickly singled out. This is a review of my paper this morning, so for those of you who wish to have a quick review before the test, here it is. The first is that participation in a study abroad program is associated with significant improvements in overall academic achievement. For example, research has demonstrated that students who study abroad are much more likely to graduate in 4 years and have moderate increases in their GPA after their study abroad experience. Also, studying abroad improves a student's intercultural understanding and communication skills. Also, because employers value study abroad experiences, students with study abroad have an advantage on the job market. And this was a slide that I placed up, but you notice that for these different cohorts, the graduation rate in 4 years is higher for those. And this is sampling all students that we sent out on study abroad. And this is the same thing with retention rates. Students stay in college if they have a international experience within the first year, and you see that it's over 10% in many cases. So in the past, study abroad was considered a luxury. When I first did study abroad, it was. And I was fortunate to be able to go on study abroad. And then later on, as I was working on my PhD, I lived here in Greece, in fact, just right down the road for 2 years. And of course, that kind of study abroad is transformative. You know, you're never the same afterwards. So if we want our students to go overseas, and some of our departments require their majors to go overseas from anywhere between 10 weeks to a full year, how do we make study abroad affordable? So in the college, what we did first was to actually see how much does it really cost the student. Because the stereotype is that it costs more to study abroad than it does to stay on campus and to do your studies. Is it in fact more expensive? So the first thing I did was a detailed cost analysis of overseas for 15 weeks as opposed to 15 weeks on campus in College Station, which is in Texas. In case you don't know where Texas is, well, that's another story. We had a paper this morning on mapping, and so perhaps you can participate. So I surveyed students who went on study abroad, and I asked them to tell me what they spent. And not only on academic costs, such as tuition and fees and books, but also on non-academic non-academic things, such as personal travel, gifts, extra meals, etc. And then I compared that to what are the official costs as published on the Texas A&M's webpage. So on the left is how much it costs the student, a student, for this fall on campus, which is $16,922. As you can see, some of that is personal expenses, etc. I also then determined what the costs were for students who are studying at Castellium Fioretino, which is where we have a study center for A&M students. Castellium Fioretino is about 10 kilometers south of Arezzo, which itself is about a 90-minute train ride south of Florence. And as you can see, the cost is tuition and fees stay the same, but is actually either lower or higher, depending upon whether or not students decide to do a lot of personal travel, which they do. Suddenly they find out about Cinque Terre, and usually quite quickly, and so they'll take weekend trips on that. And some students will actually, of course, if we're in Venice, want to do the Sound of Music tour. So once we take into account and throw out all of the extra travel and extra expenses, particularly in terms of gifts, it is actually slightly less to study abroad for a full semester in Italy as opposed to studying on campus in College Station, which itself has a very low standard of living. Cost of living, not standard of living. Yeah, I probably just got fired for that one. So anyway, so cost should not be a deterrent to students considering a study abroad program. But some parents and students still are concerned that, all right, I go on study abroad, but this will also delay timely graduation. But that is not the case at all. In fact, they graduate on time, and that decreases costs in itself. So this is a 4-year flag. This is specifically to my college. As you can see, we send out, we normally have about 1,000 students, but we also send out overseas about 300 students in the very first year. And you can see that their 4-year graduation rate are up to 20% higher in our college. And so they are graduating on time as opposed to the non-study abroad students who are graduating in 5 years and sometimes 6 years. And in fact, they're also graduating with a high GPR. So better graduation rates are important because every single semester that you stay beyond the 4 years adds to your student debt. So in other words, by just staying at A&M 1 year longer, you add about $30,000 to your student debt. So study abroad can help eliminate that in the long run. So if we want our students going overseas, how can we help them? And here is where I have taken 3 proactive steps. First of all, I work very closely with the Scholarships and Financial Aid Office at Texas A&M to ensure that students can take whatever financial aid package that they have and use it to pay for study abroad. So in that way, whatever aid they have can be applied to overseas study just as it would be if they were on campus. Then I take my operating budget and I set aside $300,000 in my operating budget, specifically for study abroad scholarships. The length of the study abroad experience dictates how much I give to the student. So a week-long field trip will yield $500. a summer session 1,500, and a semester-long program 3,000. We especially encourage field trips because assessment data have shown that students receive just as much global perspective and global awareness and intercultural communication skills as if they were on a full semester experience. Then I asked the college's development office to make study abroad one of its priorities. And ultimately, we now have 64 endowments set aside for study abroad. These 64 endowments generate about 350 scholarships for our students, which means that in effect, every student who wants to go on study abroad is eligible for an endowed scholarship. Some of these are targeted for specific disciplines. For example, we have a donor that donated about $5 million, and that goes only to English majors to study abroad. Others are dedicated to first-generation students only. In all cases, we prioritize need. Need is the #1 criterion that I use in bestowing a scholarship. So overall, between my scholarship money and what happened to my other slides? All right, now you get to listen to me. So rather than just looking at a screen, so now you will actually have to listen as opposed to hear. So between my own scholarships and the endowed scholarships, it is not uncommon, this is why we all need PowerPoints. It is not uncommon for a student to receive $5,000 to $7,000 for study abroad from my college. Then when you add in the university study abroad scholarship, as well as the current financial aid, it is not untypical for all of the students' semester abroad to be paid for. So, in conclusion, the short-term costs for study abroad are very close to what it costs for a student to remain on campus and study. One can even save in the longer term by graduating on time or even earlier. Also in the longer term, study abroad is beneficial because it helps a student to find the job that they actually will want, and it also gives them the skill sets that will advance her in that job. Employers know that overcoming the challenges of living and working abroad makes a student much more rounded and skillful. So that's why every summer at every new student conference, a certain amount of time is dedicated exclusively to convincing the students and the parents or guardians that this is the right thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oberheim. Sorry for my accent. My pronunciation is terrible. Okay,
So some Greeks have problems.
so what we're
Some
doing-
Greeks have worse accent than anybody else, and that's me.
Yeah.
join the club. Okay, so Professor Chamberlain,
That's me. Yeah.
okay, who's going to talk to us about achieving sustainable growth.
Now, this isn't my formal paper, which is, well, it's with my co-author, Dr. Kaletsi, which is being presented tomorrow. I was asked separately if I would talk about the topic of sustainable growth. And to be perfectly honest, I don't pretend to be an expert in this area. This is certainly a topic that I think draws on many different skills and backgrounds, and so all that I can do is offer my relatively narrow perspective on the topic, and do forgive me if I missed something that is germane and important, because I bring my rather narrow economist way of thinking about things to the problem. And in particular, what I'm going to do here is focus on the types of achieving sustainable growth. The original idea was this sustainable growth, and I thought, well, how can I wrestle that into a topic? And so my thought was to relate sustainable growth to industrial policy. And part of the reason for taking this particular tack is that the role of industrial policy in relation to sustainable growth has been part of the public discourse in Canada in the last very short period of time, the last 3 years or so. And so, you know, it's something that whether I'm studying it or not, I hear being discussed on the radio on almost a daily basis. So with that in the way of background, I'd like to begin with one or two definitions and give you a little bit of history, at least in my understanding of the history. A traditional interpretation of sustainable growth, and I should point out here that the word or phrase sustainable development is used as frequently as sustainable growth. Some may argue whether they mean the same thing or not. I take them to mean the same thing. But the traditional interpretation has focused on poverty, it's focused on protection of the environment, and it's focused on the utilization of natural resources. And all three of these issues relate to one another in a variety of ways. But arguably, and this is where we've come to in the contemporary discourse, sustainable growth or sustainable development should have a broader interpretation. It should focus, at least in my humble judgment and the judgment of those who perhaps aren't so humble, on a wide range of economic, social, and institutional factors. I mentioned that I'm focusing primarily here on the relationship with industrial policy, and again, as much as anything, because of where I come from. But the idea with industrial policy in relation to sustainable development is that innovation can be used to neutralize the trade-off between environmental degradation and industrial development. Now, first of all, a little bit of an introduction. Well, I suppose that was an introduction of sorts, so this is stage 2 introduction. Sustainable growth is itself a relatively new topic. The phrase only appeared, to the best of my knowledge, in the late 1980s, and initially it was tied to utilization of natural resources. It extended to some social objectives, but primarily focused on natural resources. And industrial policy aimed at supporting economic growth, I would argue, is directly related to sustainable growth for a number of reasons. First of all, industry contributes to carbon emissions, but on the other hand, industry may contribute to the development of the technology that's required in order to develop energy-efficient technologies. And of course, energy-efficient technologies may, one would hope would, serve to reduce emissions and or increase the efficiency of natural resource utilization. So the notion of industrial policy in the context of sustainable development is the realignment of industrial policy with sustainable development and to accomplish significant social benefits. Okay, so that's just a bit of an overview. First of all, industrial policy, why and what? Well, first of all, significant, the economic impact of manufacturing in terms of growth and productivities, this I guess is an economist speaking, is generally much greater than that from other types of economic activity. So with that in mind, we might ask how questions like, how is industrial policy related to growth? But before that, why manufacturing? Well, of course, the primary objective of industrial policy is to change the economic structure of the economy in favor of manufacturing. Now, the academic context for this goes back to the 1960s, and I'm sure any of you who are in some fashion connected with economics would know the name Nicholas Caldor, or Lord Caldor, a famous British economist, who argued that manufacturing was the engine of growth. We have what are known as Caldor's 3 laws, and I'll just read them to you. First of all, manufacturing is the engine of GDP growth. Secondly, productivity drives the growth of the manufacturing sector, and this is also known as Verdorba's law. And thirdly, the productivity of the manufacturing and non-manufacturing sector is positively related to the growth of the manufacturing sector. Now, as I mentioned earlier, productivity growth in the manufacturing sector historically has been relatively high, and what we observe is that the prices of services are less sensitive to GDP growth, while unit prices for manufactured goods tend to trend downwards over time. I could remember my parents buying their first television set in 1957, 21-inch black and white TV. The tubes were always bursting. A TV repairman was at our house constantly. Cost them $800, $1957. I bought a 54-inch, now admittedly not a name brand, but I've had it for perhaps 5 years now. Color TV, 54 inches, never had a problem with it. $300 Canadian in, what, $2013, something like that. So manufacturing prices, although it sometimes doesn't feel that way, day to day, trend downwards. Now, industrial policy encompasses subsectoral policies as well as incentives for general industrialization. For example, after World War II, Japan, the EU, or what was initially known as the European Coal and Steel Community, especially France and the United Kingdom, developed industrial policies. Now, over time, the notion that evolved the sectoral policies, in other words, focusing on specific sectors, steel, for example, although Mr. Trump doesn't know this, involved higher costs than benefits. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that overcapacity emerged in certain areas. Steel, ironically, was an example in Europe. And also industrial policy evolved from picking winners to defending losers. And we've seen this more recently in Canada, for example, where certain industries or firms which aren't particularly efficient or productive are kept in business for political, social, labor-related reasons. So on industrial policy, particularly in Europe, was that necessary adjustments were probably delayed for perhaps as much as 2 decades. By the 1980s, however, the trend was towards non-selective policies, greater focus on competition, deregulation of public utilities, new institutions were established, for example, Eureka, to promote competitiveness. Brings me to my third point. Industrial policy, you're putting it up, okay. I just got 3 minutes. I'm only 20% in my talk, so I better hurry up. Industrial policy in developed and developing countries and what's known as the middle income trap. So the first question is, does industrial policy really make a difference? And you have people like Paul Krugman, Nobel laureate, who would argue that it doesn't. Reviving growth rates is, having said that, reviving growth rates has become a concern of both developed and developing countries, especially since the 2008 financial crisis. Developing countries, on the one hand, many of whom have fallen into the so-called middle income trap. They've risen out of, countries have risen to a level where a preponderance of their citizens are no longer living in poverty, but at the same time, they haven't been able to, they've sort of plateaued, their economies have plateaued, and they've yet to make the next step to incomes comparable to those of the so-called developed countries. Now, growth depends on more intensive use of production factors and higher total factor productivity. Developed countries are the primary source of growth, the primary source of growth, I should say, is in total factor productivity. There's not a whole lot to be done in terms of more intensive use of production factors in most European or North American countries, at least Canada and the United States. Developing countries, on the other hand, can use industrial policy to restore growth rates and shorten the period that they fall in this so-called middle income trap. This can, I would argue, be accomplished through the manufacturing sector, in as much as it can be productivity enhancing. Having said that, however, efforts to mitigate the impact of the growth of manufacturing on industry surroundings have to be taken into consideration. And this, of course, is where we come to the question of sustainable growth. Just to give you some examples of how industrial policy could apply, I understand I'm short of time. Physical planning. Physical planning in certain sectors, transportation, education come to mind. Building comparative advantage. In other words, shifting from primary and secondary sectors, or to secondary sectors, away, for example, from agriculture to manufacturing. Planning human resources. Planning in particular the quality of the human resource complement of the economy. Now, this brings me to my second point, but I don't know how much time I have. I have 1 minute. Okay. Yeah.
He's almost as bad as I am.
I knew I only had 50 minutes, but I was ambitious about how much I could say, I suppose. Now, let me just maybe skip over some of this other background material and just jump to approximate conclusions. point that I didn't get to, but I wanted to get to, was the notion of what has been referred to as comprehensive sustainability. And essentially, when speaking about comprehensive sustainability, what we mean is the long-term ability of the economy and the environment to conserve resources for future generations. For example, internalize, as was the historical approach, at least modern history going back to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, internalizing, to use an economist's phrase, the costs associated with environmental degradation. Now, how do we accomplish this kind of integrated or comprehensive approach to sustainable growth? Well, without going into the details, I just mentioned 5 areas that need consideration. First of all, macroeconomic and financial sustainability. The macroeconomy has to be managed properly. I think it's fair to say that the macroeconomy by and large is managed much better than it was a generation ago, certainly well within my memory. Financial sustainability is related. The world and the environment can't afford more collapses like we had in 2008. And I think it's fair to say our host country here is still dealing with some of the consequences of that fallout. Second of all, social sustainability of human capital. We need policies to complement economic policies. Growth can be accomplished, or accompanied, I should say, through the reduction of poverty and improved income distribution. Likewise, the quality and level of economic growth depends on the quality and level of human capital. Education is a very important component here. Thirdly, sustainable physical infrastructure. The success of industrial policy in relation to sustainable growth, as well as any other version of growth, depends upon a strong physical infrastructure. And this in Canada is something that the current government has been focusing on. Although I would say not very successfully up until now. Infrastructure investments have to be chosen to maximize social returns, and at the same time consider, as part of the social return, sustainability. Industry, technology, and innovation need to focus on capacity to develop new products and machinery that cater to sustainable growth. And this, of course, would determine what forms research and development and innovation would take. Fifth, institutions. We need policies, after all, are the tools of institutions. And institutional capacity is needed in order to design, implement, and monitor policy of any kind, including industrial policy. Institutional reform may be required in some cases. We can't necessarily assume that existing institutions are able to do the job. And the effectiveness of reform depends on how well it is designed in addressing reform needs, and second of all, the quality of the implementation. And last but not least, regulation is important. After all, regulations are the interfaces between policy and objectives. Their quality is critical in translating objectives into realities. We need both ex-ante and ex-post regulatory impact analysis as tools in the design and review of regulations. An example of a nation that does this quite effectively, in my judgment, is South Korea. So I'll end on that note, just repeating, if I may, that first of all, we need the acceptance of a comprehensive definition of what industrial policy should look like in relation to sustainable growth. And second of all, once that is established, an appropriate framework, and I would like to argue along the lines that I've hinted at here, is necessary in order to bring the two together. Thank you very much. My apologies for
Thank you, Professor Howard. And now we have Dr. Zhang. Right? We're going to talk about the challenges of the variation management of ecosystem services in China.
Chairman, yes, good afternoon. Yes, and still continue these issues this morning. We know China pay more attention about the environment protection beyond the economic growth. So I will talk about the challenges in the development and the utilization of the existing services value. So first, is there any values in existing services? So this is a key problem because Chinese want to use economic tools to protect environment. So they want value existing services. So first, they divided the existence as ecologic capital and ecosystem services. This just is about stock. This is a floor asset. So this issue arose since a delay, yes. So 1997. And then Constanza published a paper, yes, in a Nature. So this became very popular in the world. So ecosystem services concept for managing public land in USA and some recent federal legislations. So many Chinese scholars also done relevant research. So this morning I mentioned many scholars. So national assessment in 2012, also we can studied in 2017. But how to calculate the ecologic output value? So this is a basic concept. Currently, we create a concept on ecologic output value. It means EOV. Beyond the EOV, we also use the green GDP to measurement the existing services output. So here, just some formulas, GDP, traditional GDP, but environment adjusted GDP. Okay. We found some details. GDP, NGP. Okay. So this is some details. The conventional GDP are not concerned the consumption of natural resources and the environmental degradation. So we use the green GDP to indicate environment development and economic development. So this is so we know ecological capital is infrastructure. So this is a common sense in China. So why many Chinese people teach about ecological capital? They think ecological capital is infrastructure. So this is, but how to calculate ecological compensation? So this is the definitions currently in China. So ecological compensation just is achieved to purpose of protection the ecology. So the state provides economic compensation to provide the ecological products through the institutional arrangement. So this is about it. So this is the economic calculations. From these figures, we can find. So economic compensation, there are many different numbers. This is the supply. This is a supply surplus, yes. So this is the ABC. From these figures, we can find compensation price in these terms, yes. This is a minimum, this is maximum. So when calculating compensation price, there are many numbers. That this is the minimum, this is the maximum. So this is the refactor challenges. First, part of the ecosystem services value should be included in output value calculations. This is the population's contribution as in China. It's very large. This number just is the word annual. So this is also we should calculate agroforestry output in ecosystem. We found this is in China. We do a study, the case in China, in Qinghai province. So this is a second challenge. But how to exactly measure those items? This is also reflects challenges. The third, farmland recreation value also should be calculated in the output value. This is big farmland. Forest, grassland, wetland, desert, farmland, big farmland. So this just shows a case study in China. But at an international level, how to calculate? So this reflects the challenges. Aesthetic values of farmland system also reflects the challenges. We just do some case studies. The land value compensation also is a very popular in China. This is also reflects the challenges. Just now I mentioned there are many numbers between the maximum and minimum. So this is how to calculate it. This also reflects the challenges. I think based on our study, some questions need clarification. First, from a large-scale research to multiple-scale research. So this is also we should pay more attention about it. So this is in China. Yes, in China, we just how to from a large-scale research to a multiple-scale research. You see. Second, how to develop from a static value assessment to a dynamic value assessment. Normally, we want to use these equations, but it's very, very difficult because the data, how to get the data in the national level. So this is very, very, yes, challenging problems. Okay. So the technical is no problem, but the data is very, very serious. The last, the inadequate or reversed preference and the stated preference technically we should use. Okay. So just a short case, because this is an ideal case. Also, data source, evaluate result, okay, ecologic asset value accounting. So, okay, balance sheet. So this is our challenges, issues. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lang. And our next speaker is Dr. Harris. Thank you.
My title is different than the one presented in the panel, or in the program. This one is, it's a similar topic, but the future of public spaces in a virtual world. Some lessons from the 20th century with a nod to the kinds of things we're going to see outside our door when we walk to dinner tonight, and as we go on our walking tour tomorrow morning in the neighborhoods around our hotel. We often hear that we live. I apologize for holding my paper. I can't see if I put it down. We often hear that we live in a digital age. While it's true that our social interactions are increasingly virtual and electronically mediated, we humans continue to inhabit physical spaces, and we will continue to do so. This evening, I'd like to consider how we link digital technology and urban development to create socially sustainable, thriving, and resilient communities. I would like to do so by considering the lessons of the early 20th century at the very beginning of the urban planning movement in the United States, and then consider how we can see the 21st century innovations as practiced here in Athens and its neighborhood surrounding our hotel. We take today for granted many of the connections between social life and the form of our public spaces that we see as we walk out today. It's easy to forget that many of the amenities we expect to find in our cities were invented in the 20th century to address specific social needs that arose at a time of rapid urban growth and expansion, fostered by new technologies in manufacturing, transportation, utilities, and the like. Urban expansion increased population densities, which had been largely haphazard, introducing new forms of social problems, calling attention to the need for urban planning. I wish to explore for a moment when the possibilities of planning became evident to one influential resident of my hometown, Madison, Wisconsin, using an excerpt from his travel diary. The traveler was a man named John Olin. He was an attorney from Madison, this was the Gilded Age of American history in which the big trusts and railroads pretty much ran the country. And Olin was a lawyer for many of those trusts and railroads. But remarkably, he spent most of his spare time developing parks, city parks. At first, he was developing parks for people in his own class, but then something happened in 1905 that triggered him to develop parks for working people, a very leveling and democratizing gesture that has really changed the landscape of my hometown in ways that we still benefit from today. And that was through a private organization that he organized called the Madison Park and Pleasure Drive Association. The reason I mention this is because the Park and Pleasure Drive Association was a private organization. So early development in the city of Madison of parks was not done by a municipality, by government. it was done by private organizations. And I think what we're going to see when we walk out today is we're going to see private individuals doing activities that make the city more livable. And Olin was doing something like that. The first parks in the American system, at least, tended to be pleasure drives or carriage drives. And the idea is that you, if you were wealthy enough, would have your groomsmen put your horse and carriage together, drive you and your family out into the country with a picnic made by your cook. You come to a pleasant place out of the central city. Your maid would serve you the picnic. So that was the idea of a park, right? A place to get out of the city. Think what the city might have been like. The city streets were dirt. Transport was by horse-drawn wagon. Imagine that, dirt roads, horses. That was quite a mess. Indoor plumbing would have been by coal fires, so everything would have been covered by dust. So why not just go to the backyard? The front yard's a mess. Well, the backyard was devoted to barns, to house horses, cows, chickens, wash houses, outhouses, and wells, oddly enough. So the urban environment was not nice, even if you were a wealthy person. And so the idea of pleasure drive was that people who could afford it could get out of that into the countryside where life was healthier. In Madison, that changed as a consequence of the trip John Olin took to Paris, France. And I'd like to read to you an entry that's really interesting. And it's interesting for what he learned about the possibilities of parks and planning. But it's also an insight into the moment. He wasn't the only person in the country. He was kind of part of the national trend. So lots of people were having this idea. I think but this is an interesting moment where we find someone thinking. This is what Olin says. He's August 20th, 1905, from Paris, France. He's in Luxembourg Gardens with his wife. Sunday, 5 p.m. Helen and I have just returned from a stroll in the gardens of the Luxembourg of an hour or so. It is interesting to see how many people gather here. Apparently, all classes. They come from families, they come as families and sit on benches or stroll through the gardens or gather in large numbers around the bandstand where the band plays at 5. It is a fine place for the children, and they seem to have such a fine time playing all kinds of games. And then the smaller ones playing with their little shovels and their pails in and around the gravel walks. They work so hard at it, filling their little pails and then emptying them and having such a good time. This kind of play among the children is encouraged, for those little pails and shovels are scattered on the ground. Helen and I purchased some waffles. If you've been to parks in North America, nothing out of that seems really unusual to you, right? You're going to think, that's a day in the park. Well, here's what's interesting. In the, it's conventional in the scholarship of travel narrative, travel writing, to assume that travel writers only mention things that are unusual. Things that they take for granted go unmarked. Think about that. John Olin described a city park that we would recognize today. My guess is every single thing he mentioned was remarkable to him. I counted at least 7 surprising things that Olin found. 1, walking paths. The park can be viewed by foot. Before, parks could only be viewed if you had a horse and carriage and could drive miles out of town. This is, 2, people gathered in the park rather than drive through it. Park benches encourage visitors to lengthen their stay rather than simply to walk and pass through. The Olin spent about an hour at the Luxembourg Gardens. I assume they were sitting in park benches until that time. A further implication is that park spaces can be locations of pleasure and recreation rather than places for the police to look for signs of civil unrest, in which an armed militia might confront disgruntled workers, immigrants, or both. So the urban place doesn't necessarily have to be a place of conflict, it can be a place of pleasure. 3, a park is a place for people of different classes to interact as equals. So in a world of social and physical separation by class and race, the park was a level. And again, Olin wouldn't have known any working people who didn't serve him. So the idea that he could encounter in a public park people in their class was quite surprising to him. 4, entire families visit park. The idea of the park is a multi-generational place that includes both males and females. We take it perfectly for granted. For Olin, evidently that was a surprise in Luxembourg Gardens. 5, the park has programming with specially designed structures, band in the bandstand. Such programming requires, and structure require planning before construction and active management after construction. Bandstands do not occur in nature. 6, children may go to the park and play. To that end, park organizers distribute toys in an effort to direct play. The needs of children, to my knowledge, had never entered Olin's mind before, and not the mind of many parks planners. 7, food vendors operated the park. Food vending was novel to Olin. And the reason I say this was influential in his thinking, I'm writing a biography of Olin, and this is why I've found this interesting. It changed the way Olin developed parks in the city and allowed us to become part of the larger movement in terms of urban planning in the United States. Within a few years of returning home from this vacation, Olin started developing a different kind of park for working class neighborhoods to meet the needs of residents. In particular park, the particular park had been a miniature pleasure drive for people who didn't have carriages. Rather than driving a carriage through and seeing the views, they would walk on paths. And we know they would walk on paths because there were chains along paths and signs saying don't walk on grass. And so working class people generally stayed away. Their only time off was Sunday afternoons. And after working our job 6.5 days a week, they just didn't see any point in doing more walking. So something had to bring them in. So within a few years, Olin had installed park benches, he'd removed the chains, he'd removed the signs, although it was, I think, 1954 before the parks director said, oh, we've taken the last stay off the grass sign off. I have seen what you can only see it from the ice rink in winter. Band had benches, band concerts, ice cream vendors. Children were encouraged to play in the park and walk on the grass. The park was all of a sudden a very popular place. It was a lively place. It was a gathering place for many in the neighborhood. In fact, people who didn't live in the neighborhood would come into the neighborhood just to enjoy that particular park. Within 3 years, Olin had overseen the construction of 2 specially designed playgrounds for the use of children, each one staffed by a paid superintendent to direct play. He also persuaded the city and the University of Wisconsin to go together and create a man named John Nolan with N, to the newly created position of park planner, the result of which was the city's first comprehensive plan entitled Madison Model City. Madison a Model City. What's interesting about Madison Model City is it was one of the first comprehensive city plans, and it continues to guide development within our central city, particularly with respect to public access to the 4 lakes surrounding the city. Most of the park, we're surrounded by 4 lakes, a good chunk of which is public land, public accessibility, parkland, in fact. And what's really interesting is that because it was one of the first plans, it became, Olin's document became something of a primer for the urban planning movement in the early 20th century. It was kind of a visionary plan. It was full of vision. It was full of lofty ideas and ideals, with beautiful pictures. And I think that's the reason it became popular with both urban planners and with city officials, because it was easy to sell one plan. The fact that it was so lofty is the reason it remains unrealized today, even though it's still very influential in our city. 3 minutes. I don't need 3 minutes. So notwithstanding this concern, today, right, what happens today when we live in an environment where we're socially isolated and share our built environment, when we don't maybe know our neighbors in our own apartment except virtually? urban, and one of the problems is that for years, urban planning strategy has been dominated by thinking about the physical city, landmark architecture, transport, housing, urban development, increasingly the technological infrastructure to create smarter, more productive, greener cities. But what happens now when we live in a city designed for living in an age before the computer? So how do we adapt this environment to make it more livable? And I'd say that placemaking is one of the ways we can do this. And we see examples of it when we go out and we see urban spaces that are turned into places. I can take two examples walking down, I'm going to spell it wrong, walking down Panapistomio Street last night. And it was really interesting. One of them was kind of an official place. There was a changing regard in front of Parliament. Clearly that was a planned thing, but all day, I walked by there several times, there was always a crowd of people out there. A place that was otherwise would have no activity was a lively place. Buses were stopping, people were running across the street from the Christmas tree display. It was wonderful. Down the street from a different building, there was a protest going on. Clearly that wasn't something that the city had planned, but people saw, here's an empty space, we've got something to say, we've got something to do. They used it. By the time I got there, I heard about it, people had largely gone away. So again, for a very short time, it was repurposed for a different reason. It brought people into the city, and allowed all kinds of activities. When it was over, people left. And I think we'll see all kinds of these kinds of activities. And again, what interests me is how these activities are largely citizen-drawn, not necessarily government-drawn. So, again, so these small, locally organized planning environments, we can start to do policy that will allow us humans to